Join me now to discuss that and much more. House Democratic Caucus Chair Hakeem Jeffries. Congressman, thanks so much for being with us.
Good morning.
Why is Republican Congressman Amash out there further than Democratic leadership? He says, let's launch the impeachment proceedings. You say, not yet.
Well, impeachment is not on the table and impeachment is not off the table. We are in evidence gathering mode.
It's got to be one or the other. It's got to be one or the other. It's either on the table or off the table.
No, I think we're in evidence gathering mode, and then we'll determine what's the best way to proceed. We have to follow the facts. We have to apply the law. We have to be guided by the Constitution. If that journey leads us to a finding of high crimes and misdemeanors, so be it. But there's a process that we need to follow. This is our most solemn constitutional responsibility, and we take it seriously.
Is it near the table? I mean, why not launch an impeachment inquiry to answer some of the questions that Congressman Amash and you seem to suggest need to be answered?
Well, Chairman Jerry Nadler has indicated that we are going to have hearings before the Judiciary Committee on a variety of issues, including obstruction of justice, abuse of power, and the culture of corruption that appears to exist at 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue. Those are perhaps the most troubling pieces of information that spring forth from the Mueller report. But there's evidence that we need to collect in order to proceed in a real thoughtful and comprehensive way. We need the unredacted Mueller report because we can't trust the redactions that were made by this Attorney General. We need the underlying documentation. Jerry Nadler has subpoenaed that. And we ultimately need to hear from Bob Mueller publicly. Sure. So he can tell his story.
Publicly, although I've heard from the number 3, the House Whip, Jim Clyburn, who says he'd be willing to hear from Mueller privately if the transcript is released. Is this a political consideration? Do you guys just not want to go through with this because you're concerned of the political ramifications if you do? No,
I think the Speaker has been clear that politics shouldn't guide a decision to impeach and politics shouldn't guide a decision not to impeach. We, at the end of the day, as you know, impeachment for the House is that we functionally are the equivalent of the grand jury. We have to gather the information and present that information ultimately to the American people and then to the Senate should articles of impeachment be voted out of the House. So we have to gather the evidence.
One of the things you would need in the Senate, if it ever got there, is Republican votes. And it would help you politically, although you say it's not political, if you got some Republican votes in the House. Congressman Amash was asked about whether or not there are more Republicans. And listen to what he said very quickly.
By the way, a lot of them think I'm right about the Mueller report, and they just won't say it. There are a lot of the Republicans.
The Congress says a lot of Republicans think he's right about the Mueller report, but won't say it. Have you spoken to any Republican members in the House who think that he's right about the Mueller report?
Well, we haven't seen any evidence of that yet. And in part, that's because, you know, the Republicans have basically functioned like wholly owned subsidiaries of the Trump administration, not as a separate and co-equal branch of government. That's been unfortunate. I applaud Congressman Amash's courage. But it doesn't seem to be in high supply on the other side of the aisle.
You haven't been able to convince any Republicans, in other words.
Well, the Republicans don't seem willing to be convinced based on the fact that they are just subservient to Donald Trump.
All right. Senator Mitch McConnell, the Senate Majority Leader, last night made clear that if there is a Supreme Court vacancy, which we don't know that there will be next year, he would work to confirm whomever the president nominates for that seat. That is far different than 2016 when he held up the confirmation of Merrick Garland, who was President Obama's pick. I know you think this is hypocritical. I know you think that this shows that Mitch McConnell just wants to control who gets on the court and not. I guess my question to you is, do you see any evidence that Democrats will vote on this? How will you convince Democratic voters that this matters?
Well, I think Mitch McConnell is Exhibit A as to why what happens in November of 2020 with respect to the Senate matters. He's a shameless individual, and this does not just simply apply to his behavior as it relates to stealing a Supreme Court seat that Barack Obama had the right to present to the American people. This relates to the fact that House Democrats have passed legislation after legislation on issues like protecting people with pre-existing conditions, driving down the high cost of life-saving prescription drugs, dealing with the anti-competitive practices of Big Pharma, universal criminal background check legislation, the Paycheck Fairness Act, because we believe that women should be paid equally for equal work. All of these bills have moved out of the House and been sent to the Senate, where it's a legislative graveyard right now. And McConnell is negligent in doing the business of the American people. So we think that the Supreme Court issue should be a voting issue in November of 2020, and his failure to act on the priorities of the American people that we have been working on as House Democrats should be a voting issue in 2020.
Speaking of legislation, you are reintroducing legislation to decriminalize marijuana federally. First of all, why? And second of all, do you think this will get a vote in the full House?
I'm certainly hopeful with the leadership of Senator Schumer in the Senate, who has been driving this legislation forward, along with several others. We're building upon the First Step Act, which we passed in a bipartisan way in the last Congress, meaningful criminal justice reform to help currently incarcerated individuals successfully transition back into society and roll back some of the draconian sentencing laws that were put into place during the failed war on drugs. This is a bipartisan issue. Democrats, Republicans, the left, the right, progressives, and conservatives. Marijuana reform, I believe, is the next step in this process.
Any White House outreach? Obviously, First Step had the help of Jared Kushner, and ultimately the president signed up. Have you been in touch with the White House? Any sense that anyone inside that building's on board with this?
Well, it's not clear yet where the White House stands on marijuana reform, but I am in regular communication with Jared Kushner, as are many of my colleagues, on the issue of criminal justice reform, and I believe he continues to be an authentic partner.
All right. Well, let us know if you hear back, because that would be a huge development if this is something that the White House signed on to.
Certainly.
All right. Democratic House Caucus Chair Hakeem Jeffries, great to have you here at Hudson Yards. Really appreciate it.
Thank you, John.
Allison?
Okay.